Hey, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the RF Frontiers podcast. I am joined by my co host, Sean Wallace and Ariel Carlson, and our guest today, Bob Sandage, who has what an incredible career this guy has had. Oh my gosh, what an incredible career. It's not even that important to know where he is right now, but at the moment it's with National Instrument because it's really about his history. This guy has built, he told us in prep, like 4 businesses, okay? And not all of them in the RF space, which adds a really cool wrinkle, okay? So we're going to get into it deep. What RF Frontiers podcast is, it's a podcast for small, medium business entrepreneurs by small, medium business entrepreneurs. We're here to help you with the intersection between technology, operations, supply chain, go-to-market, and strategy so that we can help other RF entrepreneurs succeed, frankly. So we're just going to roll right into it. Everyone, welcome.
Good morning, Chuck.
Thank you. Thanks, Chuck.
Good morning. It is morning here as the sun rises, and I have the cardboard blocking out most of the sun here on my very bright window. And at least it's a great day without the snow today. So welcome. So, Bob, you're the star of the show today. No pressure.
Awesome.
So you had told us a great story in prep about, just to get to know you and how this all goes down. You had told us about essentially a journey that took you into being a lifelong entrepreneur and 4 businesses. Okay. Let's focus on how you got started in that RF, entrepreneurial journey. What in God's name drove you to do that? You could have easily just gotten a job like you had your first job. You could have easily just taken the easy way out, frankly, as if anything's the easy way out. What got you started?
Yeah, it's a good question, Chuck. And first of all, I'm happy to be here. I look forward to sharing my stories. So when I was in grad school at Iowa State University, so working on analog IC design, the old dinosaur type stuff. A lot of that. So my senior project was designing a wideband RF amplifier. We designed an FM receiver on a chip that was funded by Tektronix. So that was my first foray into saying, I'm designing circuits and it's not just on a breadboard, but this is actually working on a chip. And we actually got it to work for a few seconds, when it came back the next semester. We learned a lot about temperature drift, with oscillators. So that was kind of the first foray into RF, and I got my graduate degree in electrical engineering. Worked at Medtronic in Minneapolis on IC design for pacemakers for a couple of years. Not really any RF there, but I love the company and I thought I wanted to teach. So off I went back to Georgia Tech, and so designing lots more chips. Some stuff being in the RF domain, but not really focused on that. But I also did start my own company, Dactron, in 1994. And I'd say the first four years was mostly just all geographic-based systems integration. So it was working for, hey, automate this with a carpet mill or a chicken processing plant, or a steel mill, Johnson Controls for destroying car seats. They weren't supposed to be destroyed, but you wanted to test all the forces on them. So I actually did destroy one of them. Unfortunately, a very expensive one.
And so 1994 was really early in the LabVIEW days. Was this a LabVIEW based business?
Yeah, while I was at Medtronic, I used LabVIEW. It was kind of very novel, using patient data, heart rate data, with pacemakers implanted, and then looking at kind of how our. And I kind of look at it like, well, this was not to pat myself on the back, kind of revolutionary for the time, because I was essentially modeling these complex systems that would almost never converge in SPICE. Because lots and lots of mixed signal stuff, and as soon as you start breaking it down, now here's blocks for amplifiers, comparators, filters, etc., and start running patient data through that, you could actually, okay, now I can see the impact of changes I make in the design. And so it's kind of like, I look at that as very early model-based systems engineering, presented on that in the 96 IEEE ISCAS symposium. So it was pretty cool. That's where my first start with LabVIEW, and then went to the first ever NI user symposium in 1993. I think there were about 100 people. It was in the Austin Stouffer Renaissance up in the Arboretum area, and that was the start. That was the very first NI big assembly of people using their hardware and software. And so from there, after I left Medtronic, went to Georgia Tech. It didn't take me very long to say, I just got this thing in the mail for National Instrument seminar. Chuck Woolsey, my area sales manager, is giving it, and I went and talked to him afterwards. He says, you ever thought about starting a business? And so it was, we talked for probably a month, and before I know it, I'm buying a computer. Which those days, Sean, it was like, well, actually you're not as old as I am, but it was like a $3,500 computer that was like it might have been like a 486 or something. I don't know. It was not really all that great.
And I think LabVIEW was Macintosh only in the early days, right?
Yeah, my first 1992 at Medtronic was version 2.2.1 on the Mac. And it wasn't Windows wasn't at a
Right.
point yet where you could actually have something like that on it. So
So
yeah, it
Are you
was,
guys just doing that to suck up to me because I'm such an Apple fanboy? You might
That could be it.
It might
Could
be.
be it. Could be.
It's a far cry different from a lot of the software that we rely on in the industry nowadays, where it's all Windows based and you can't do that at all.
Yeah. Well,
So-
you know,
or a lot of it can be Linux based too. So that's the good news.
the whole promise of LabVIEW was that it was a graphical interface. So the idea of
Yeah,
running
yeah.
a graphical
Yep.
interface on DOS was kind of a non-starter.
I did all
yeah.
the text based, back then C, C++, Pascal, Fortran, Basic, all of
Yeah.
that in college. And then I loved the programming element of it, using that to solve some problems. And then when, the graphical piece, like, oh, I really like this. So,
Yeah.
it's definitely got its pluses and minuses, but for me, it's worked, even up
So-
through like last year when I was doing more LabVIEW programming than I ever thought I would.
Well, what I
Much
love
like
about this story that you got into it is so much with any business, RF or otherwise, whether intentionally or by kismet or happenstance, people get into something on the early days, right? And there haven't always been gold rushes to the to the new technology, especially when you have something so niche as LabVIEW, right? It is hardly large language models and the gold rush that we have to that, or the telecom technology that happened back in the 90s. But so often success of the business is because people end up being early adopters. Maybe it's just because they're the only one that's out there, or maybe it's because they have some insight that others don't have. Hopefully both. And that's a surefire way to be a rocket, create a rocket launch on your career.
Yeah, so he really, I mean, it sounds like Bob really got in, on the ground floor of LabVIEW, right? So, and so did it kind of sound to me like maybe starting a business was actually not your idea?
Well, it's kind of one of those things, it can be,
Yeah.
fairly enticing as somebody that's going to grad school, getting a pretty measly stipend as a
Right.
as a research assistant, and
Yeah.
I thought, okay, I can control my hours, the projects I work on.
Yeah.
It sounded good in theory, but before I knew
Sounds-
it, I was working, like 18 hours a day.
Yeah, of course, right.
At that time, making $75 an hour, and even
Not
never
bad.
paying tax. Like, wow, this is not too bad of a salary as a
Especially if
graduate
you're,
student. So
especially if you're young and don't have a family yet, right? So,
yeah,
yeah.
yep, exactly.
Yeah.
I carried on like that for a few years. And 1997 is really where things got interesting, because through all my, a lot of me going out and, doing my own marketing, but then, a certain portion of it was coming from the area sales manager, Charles. And, he's like, hey, I just talked to so-and-so. I got a lead from these guys that have a DAX system. They want to do something. He came up with one and said, hey, I've got this company called Arris, Arris, in Atlanta. And
I know
they
them well.
Yeah, they joint. Yeah, obviously, I think you probably would, Chuck. Joint venture between at that time Nortel and Antec. And so their whole thing was, we're making a box that goes on the outside of your house. Cable comes in from the street, and then what comes out in your house is 1, 2, or 4 phone lines, and your cable TV service and some higher speed internet, versus like that time it was like, wow, if you got like 20 whatever K baud, you're like, wow, this is pretty nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was definitely a step up. I remember when I first went in there, even I know all the people that I was talking to at that point, and it was between myself as Dactron and HP. So this is before HP spun off Agilent, and so they had an HPV system they were quoting, and I looked at the bench that their whole purpose was to make an automated test system for their production testing, which they were just in the next year going to be moving that over to Mitsumi in Japan. And then from there throughout other facilities within Asia, but they were going to start the pilot and the initial first year in Japan. And so I looked at this bench full of equipment that's 10, 15, 20 years old. You can't even find replacements for some of it. Telephony test sets, the POTS, the plain old telephone system, testing the phone lines, the RF, back in that day it was a HP, the old 8590 something, spectrum analyzers,
Yeah.
looking for noise and spurs and channel powers. And so
I think I have that one on a shelf out, by the way, sitting
know
in
what?
my shop right
You
now.
can still get them on eBay.
I use my last company, and I will say, you guys being RF, it's like, man, you start looking at the fidelity of some of those things, you're like,
Yeah.
holy cow, these are still really good pieces of equipment.
The 8590 is the RF version of the Tektronix 4665 analog oscilloscope.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I used one just last year and a half, 2 years at my old company, and I couldn't find the drivers that work for it, so I just wrote my own GPIP drivers for it, and
There you go.
it became a great piece of lab equipment that we could just sit on the bench and do some some measurements, some cals with, et cetera.
Yeah.
But-
Well, and it's really interesting, right? Because in those days, it was the confluence of LabVIEW and GPIB
Right.
that really made National Instruments grow and allowed
that's
businesses
That's how the company
like
was
yours
founded.
to- yeah,
Dr. T and I guess Kodowski,
right.
they said, you know what, we've got a military contract. We're going to make this
Yep.
board that actually communicates with instruments. So,
I mean, I think it's easy to forget. They say, oh, they wanted to automate this thing, but it was in those days. It wasn't so obvious that you could automate anything, right?
Yeah.
So GPIB.
do you remember what the original 800 number was for NI?
No, what was it?
4333488. It's spelled IEEE 488.
I love it. It's fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, clearly it's a show. Clearly, it's a podcast for geeks too. So
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
you
Yep.
have to appreciate that kind of stuff, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
but back to that one story, it was, so it was a long journey. Like I was used to, these projects that might be, small between maybe a couple of days to maybe a month. And this was a pretty significant program, a significant investment for Aris. And, it took months and months, like I said. And finally I said, you know what? I mean, I'm just going to make a mock-up of what this thing would look like. LabVIEW's got a great user interface. So I took all of their tests, put on a front panel, check boxes and test name and, upper and lower limits. And here's your value. It's just spitting out, simulated data and like maybe some simulated screen captures of an RF spectrum.
Yeah.
And got the PO like within 2 days.
So
Was anybody else doing anything like this, Bob?
No, I mean, at that point, HPV and HP was coming in. I don't know if they had they probably didn't have an integrator because, I know traditionally NI has been, like, as Sean knows. I mean, NI is big on partners, and so I don't know that HP really had a partner. And that's probably that's really what closed the deal is. Charles brought in me as a partner, and I think it was a dilemma for them. Like, wow, this is essentially one guy, maybe a one guy plus a part-time helper. Do we trust that our production testing for what's going to be millions of these products is going to work? And I think, just generating some simulated reports. I had almost no requirements. I had just maybe some, here's the limits on so I could put those in there, but there's very, very little in requirements. And then once that happened, they said, wow, this is amazing. This is it may not be exactly, but this is close to what we're looking for. And they said, let's go. And
What you say there about being a partner and a part-timer. Sean and Ariel and I talk about this all the time. It's about that risk of, do I work with a small business?
Yeah. Right.
Right. But
And-
all
and
the great
Aris is-
innovation,
Aris is a huge
comes
corporation,
from the small businesses.
Oh, yeah.
If anything, there's an incentive in the larger businesses to kind of, choke it down a little bit, right? Because small businesses are nimble, they can really come up with something and make a lightning strike pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
So we talk about there's a risk. Oh, well, should I work with them because they only have a certain number of people? But on the contrary, how can you afford not to?
Right.
The great things are coming out of these startup businesses, which are small, start as a 1 or a 2 or a 3-person shop, essentially.
Yeah.
How can you afford not to consider them? And indeed, look, it keeps happening in the industry. The small businesses keep coming, the small businesses keep growing, and new ones come along all the time. They get acquired, they evolve. Somebody goes off and they say, oh, I have a great idea that I didn't think of before, and boom, your next one is born.
Yeah.
So too often risk comes into that conversation, but I say, how can you risk not taking the risk, if you will?
So
I've had so many discussions with work colleagues, friends, family. My family, my family, I was like, oh, he's going to talk about this again. It's a, this is it's our fabric, DNA as a country. That's what I think has made America what it is. Is that for all of the $100 billion companies or bigger, they didn't start off as a $100 billion company. They started off as one person, maybe a small number of people with an idea, and being agile and being adaptable and going through some pain. Sean and I don't have a whole lot of hair, probably.
All three of us. This is the three bald guy.
So that's I think what's really made our industry, just in the country, test and measurement industry and the country really great. It's just small companies.
I think it's a partnership between the small companies and the big companies too, right? Because NI and Dr. T had to take a risk on partnering with small businesses, right? And then RS had to also take a risk. So it's interesting, we like to talk about technology, about the different kinds of technology complementing each other, but in this case, it's the business structure, right? And maybe NI was willing to do it because they were still growing and they remembered what it was like to be two guys, and so maybe they were more willing to work.
I feel like
company,
being involved with them from the early days. I think when I started my company in 1994, the Alliance program was fairly new. It was maybe a couple of years old. I think at that point, I don't think it went back into the 80s. But back in the 80s, they really NI wasn't to the point where they probably needed. They're just selling data acquisition cards. It really is once you start getting into there's some bigger solutions that we just can't take on as a company that's making these software and hardware products. They did something that was I think at that time kind of revolutionary, and even to this day, Keysight may have channel partners, but I just don't see the same level of network camaraderie. And I know
that's what I was going to say. Is as you mentioned earlier in our pre-show talk, the surface level aspect of just small businesses being able to meet better a relational aspect in business. And that's a huge win for working with a small business is you seem to be able to have the more intimate relationships to grow business a lot quicker than if you're working with a corporation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, Ariel. Like when you look at small businesses, a lot of small businesses are populated by longtime employees. A strong small business has employees that last 5, 10, 15 years. corporations, when you work with a giant corporation, those guys, they're there to move up the corporate ladder. So they're continually moving into a new role every year or two.
Well, especially in today's world, you know, your turnover rate for working with millennial Gen Z is high.
Yeah. So when people think about, you know, the quote unquote risk of working with a small business, it's like, well, what's the risk of working with an employee at a giant corporation who really his motivation is just to get his next promotion? So it's interesting, I think, that in some ways the small business is way better for the for the relationships in the long term. But
yeah, you're right. I think a lot of us small business, you know, more the entrepreneurial type, we don't go into it to be you know quick. You know, we're gonna flip something really quick. It's going to be longer term, and you probably don't do it to you know. I mean, obviously, yes, it'd be great if you sold something and it you know made a lot of money. You know, I did okay in the sale of Dactron, but it wasn't like, you know, I think between that and the brewery and other things, I've put together some spreadsheet, you know, back about 5 years ago, said, you know, essentially, you know, pretty closely estimated what I paid employees in my whole, you know, time as an employer. It's somewhere at this point over like $25 million.
Fantastic.
You know, and I don't have $25 million in the bank.
That's awesome.
You know?
That's the best win story I've heard. You know, making $25 million payroll that's the American success story.
Yeah. So essentially from 94 to now, so a little over 30 years, you know, I've paid employees $25 million, and I'm happy. You know what?
That's a lot of families you supported.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what? I've just honestly, from the bottom of my heart, I'm really grateful that you mentioned that you told it that way. It just tells me something about the guy you are. Honestly, in this world, as you know, Ariel just stated about, you know, the way things are today, hyper focus on private equity and hyper focus on seed round funding and hyper growth and all of these different things. To hear someone talk about how they've been able to, frankly, you know, two guys, frankly, talk about how they've been able to take care of families. Frankly, it just, okay, I love you guys forever, frankly. Because I'm in this for the long haul. You know, I've been in this industry for quite some time. I'm in a privileged position to be able to help to take care of families and actually care about these people that work for us.
Yeah.
And it's not lost on me that, you know, I'm trying to make their life better, not just trying to, you know, sell cables and make a buck.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another real quick feel good story if you want. You know, the tech downturn of 2000, 2001, there was, and it still haunts me a little bit, where, you know, 2001, things fell out so quickly that I was letting people go. I think one day I went from 30 employees to 18, you know, and, you know, I had to let people go that they'd only been there for 5 months. You know, one had just had a baby like 3 weeks before. It was like, are you kidding me? You know, it just, you know, tore me up to have to do that, you know, and I actually got as I posted on LinkedIn recently that I got this position at National Instruments. I had a guy that I had let go. He'd worked at Dactron for 5 months in 2001, and he's now a director at Humanoid, you know, robotics, you know, type company. And he said, "Hey, I've kept, you know, kind of lurked back there, noticing what you're doing on LinkedIn. I just have to say, you know, that, you know, I can see now how hard that probably was for you to have to do that, you know, because now he's in a position where he's making decisions on who, you know, who comes in, who can stay, who has to go. And he says, you know, it provided me the, you know, the kick to do something different that I now love, and I appreciate what you know, everything you did for me in that short time at Dactron. So, you know, it's stories like that. It's like you said, family. You know, I almost look at like my Dactron employees, my brewery employees, my kids. You know, it's
Awesome.
I want to see them succeed, and, you know, if they end up, you know, going somewhere else, hopefully not that I let them go, but, you know, that they go somewhere else. I want to see them do better. So
that's fantastic.
I think when I was interviewing this last year, I have 75 people at least that I know that have either went on to start their own businesses, become, you know, higher ups at a company, just they're doing something really incredible. That makes me happy.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Well, probably the greatest thing we can do, frankly, is to multiply ourselves. So if all I'm doing as an early entrepreneur, as a consultant, is trading 1 hour of my time for 1 hour of my billable rate, things are good, and I can make a living. But if you can find a way to parlay that into multiplying yourself, okay, and creating progeny, right, and spawning something great. We think about it in the mentor-mentee relationship, and it may not be that. It may be quite a bit more subtle than that, but you multiply yourselves in many ways. Having multiple employees, right, you're able to multiply your efforts and do greater good for your customers and more. And then each of those goes off to have a career, and some of them go to do great things as well, and we don't realize the subtle influences we have on their lives. Your story comes from something, unfortunately, it was a dark time for all of us, but yet we can all do it, and in the end smile because we got through it, and a lot of us came out better.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about how you multiplied, right? So you started. Was it just you, and when you started the business?
Yeah, it was just me.
It was just you.
Yeah, I think the first 3 years was just myself, pretty much working out of my second room or my basement.
And then you just hired. Did you find a partner? Did you find employees? How did you make that move from solopreneur to a real business scale?
Yeah, the first person was part-time. He was one of my grad assistant colleagues that we shared an office, I think 4 or 5 of us, and he was really good at software. And he had
your
probably
second was
15 or 20 hours a week that he could help out. So
So you went right to the technical help was your second employee.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And at this point, I'm doing the marketing and the accounting, and maybe sometimes not all that well. Might have been well, I shouldn't say I didn't straggle too long on sending the invoices.
Yeah, that's always the solopreneur struggle, is sending out the invoices. Yeah.
So really, I think when I brought second person on, he's somebody that had graduated from Virginia Tech, and that was working somewhere else, and through the National Instruments area sales manager, I was able to say, hey, Matthew looks like he's looking for for something else at this point. So he was my first full-time employee. And then at that point I was so kind of little extension of that earlier story. Once we got the production the manufacturing test system for the cable modems, and at that point it wasn't even DOCSIS, it was more proprietary,
Right.
And DOCSIS 1.0 was just starting to come out. So I spent almost all of 1998 in Japan. I think I was over there 13 times in 1998.
And is that because RS had production in Japan, or they were doing the standard setting in Japan?
Mitsumi was their contract manufacturer. They moved once they got things proven out in Atlanta, they said, okay, we're getting the manufacturing line set up in Akita, Japan, far northern Japan. And I remember the first trip, they're like, oh yeah, we can do this with Bob remotely. And that might have been the worst 2 weeks of my life, because essentially, being 12, 13 hours, depending on the time zone, whether we're daylight or not, it's, I would get done with my normal work or my school work at 5, 6 o'clock, and then I'd start getting calls from Japan, and I was up all night long and trying to integrate. You thought you got all the kinks worked out, and then now you're seeing things. Now there's some of the first production units coming down the line, and 2 weeks I was literally a zombie.
And that's literally a phone call. It was no Zoom.
It was a phone call, and connections dropping, and trying to. It literally was. I think it.
Long
I
distance.
got
You probably have to pay
9,600
international.
baud, actually connection to a system in Japan. It was lucky, and you bring especially LabVIEW, you bring a cursor across, and like a few seconds later it moves.
Yes, right.
It was horrible. And so I think for 2 weeks I probably got no more than about 2 hours of sleep a night.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
when they came back, they got things to a point. We all got things to a point where it was somewhat going. And I said, hey guys, next time you're gonna have to send me over there. This is. I can't do this. And, so they paid for me to go over there, and there was, new products, and we're just coming out. Now here's the 2-line model, here's the 4-line model, here's, indoor version. It's like, you name it. And I think within 2 years, they introduced probably at least a dozen, maybe to 20 different products.
So in those days, this was basically hourly consulting, right? You weren't thinking about products, right? Is that right? And you were kind of funding. You hire a person in, you just build them out, and so kind of just cash flow itself.
So
Is that the basic
essentially,
idea?
when I hired Matthew full time, he became, because it was one of those double-edged swords where it's like I couldn't spend enough time training him to, like, I'll just send Matthew over to Japan. He wasn't up the curve enough, so he would handle a lot of the local geographical based systems integration type projects, and did really well at it.
Right.
To the point where I didn't have to worry about that piece. So I'm in Japan communicating with him on these projects for a lot of 1998. And
But it cash flowed itself, right? Because he was billable on day one, essentially, because you had started with a technical employee.
Not to get too far into numbers, but I think 97, I think, as a business, I was 55,000 in sales, and then 1998 was 220, and then 99 was 1.1 million.
So this is a
2000
classic.
was 5.5 million. So it was
a bootstrap success story, essentially, right? Yeah.
And so, we're at that point, now getting into probably like 1999, I'm able to start sending him over there. I'm able to start working on more of the business type stuff, working on the marketing. We brought in somebody to help us with trade shows, and a full-time marketing person that then got all of our literature. It's all standardized, looks amazing. Product photography. Now we have a full-on system, production systems, and that's when we started. Aris started, hey, we're working on a DOCSIS 1.0 version of this particular product, and so. Some of the people spun off a little entity, but so we worked for both of them. But that was really where now we're in a standards based instead of Aris proprietary kind of world.
Right.
Yeah. So I think you didn't say it, but I think probably what you did is you set your rates high enough that there was enough margin to pay for that marketing, right? Because
Exactly.
I think that the trap that I see a lot of solopreneurs and really small integrators fall into is they set their rates so that they can support their family, but they can't support any marketing or an admin person or accounting or anything. And so you just have a couple engineers who just bill hourly, and their margin's just not high enough to build a real company. But it sounds like you escaped that trap.
Yeah, no, kind of what we did, and I don't want to say like pat myself on the back, but essentially redesign their system. After seeing some of the headaches and hiccups the the first probably 6 months of integration, I just went, back to the drawing board. I said, I've designed electronics, down to the chip level, board level. We designed boards that replaced 20-year-old telephony test sets. This board, you send it a command, it starts a ringing signal that can then be measured by this cable modem, or now going into DOCSIS type device. The RF stuff, that was about the same time that 99 2000 NI was releasing their first PXI RF. And so, I mean, even backing up from there, PXI was the first systems were big desktop kind of computer mounted in a rack. And then when PXI came out, I was the on the ground floor, for good or bad. There was a lot of I could talk for days. There was controllers. Might have worked great on a lab bench, but as soon as you start running them through production, testing 24 hours a day, we had one point where, after redesigning the system, and then now there's PXI RF, and having controllers like dropping like flies in Asia, and up, production line 1 is down, up, production line 3 is down, and you're like, oh my
great
gosh.
look.
What is it you say? The lab ain't the real world, Sean?
The lab ain't the real world. Yeah, exactly.
Shocking.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had, I think there might be still 1 or 2 people left in those days that were, significant, like, and then Bill Reed, I think he's probably gone from NI now, but he told me years later, he says, if it weren't for what Dactron was doing, we wouldn't have been anywhere near where we are in PXI or RF. It's
That's
just
fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a great partner story for NI, a real success story.
We had some real come to Jesus meetings at NI. I flew there a few times, and it's like, guys, we've got, they were in damage control mode, supplying spare controllers, and now some trust is kind of, we had a few, not as much, but a few issues with the PXI RF, the initial 5660 RF analyzer.
I remember it. Yeah. I mean, in those days, just putting RF stuff near computer stuff was viewed as highly risky, right? There was this belief in the industry that, like, it's RF, you can't have switching power supplies, you can't put it too close to a CPU. And
I'm sure that was all of, probably at that time, Agilent's, pitch that, you don't want to use this. It's
I'm sure they definitely did use some FUD on that. Yeah.
I hope that's not true, because I literally just redesigned to test station, and I got a nice computer sitting right next to a great big Anritsu VNA. It's about that far apart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately what they did with the 5660 and the 5661, which came later, was they got really, really good at CNC machined enclosures.
Yeah, sure.
And so there's still computer noise everywhere, but it was all shielded extremely well, and so they figured it out.
Of course.
But yeah. So, I mean, at some point, though, just to jump ahead a little bit, right? Cable modems were obviously exploding in the world, right? This was almost everyone in the United States touched their lives cable modems, right? Because everybody had dial-up, and then you went to DSL, and DSL was supposed to be great, but it turns out it was awesome, or terrible rather. And then cable modems came out, DOCSIS, right? And this was like finally true broadband to the home. I guess DOCSIS 1.0, and then I don't even know what up to DOCSIS 5, whatever it is now.
It's 4.0 now. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. But at some point, like, you started out as a consultant, essentially billing hours with ARRIS, right? And then at some point, though, I just know from my own information that Dactron started selling a product, and it became the industry standard that tested all of the cable modems in the United States, essentially, which is like an amazing achievement, right? What was it a slow transition where you went from a couple guys consulting to the industry standard product, or was it a conscious choice that you made and you did it fast?
That's a good question. And I think about that time where production lines are rolling, they're starting to work on DOCSIS 1.0 designs, and I've been out to all the trade shows, and so once again we're talking signal to noise. Is this just something that these guys are working on, this particular customer, or is it something that's a broader trend? And I could definitely tell that it was DOCSIS 1.0 and then 1.1. So we got involved with Cable Television Labs. It's now Curio out in Louisville, Colorado, and they were the ones that were the one working on the DOCSIS standard. And so
they were like a nonprofit industry consortium, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So they essentially if you wanted to have a cable modem or cable modem based device in a house in the U.S., it had to have a Cable Lab sticker on it. Cable Lab certified.
Yeah, that's the ultimate monopoly.
It was. Yeah. And
so you kind of recognize, you kind of rode on their monopoly status a little bit, right? You say, hey, if these guys own the market, we want to be associated with them. Was that the basic idea?
Yep. And another really, so was at all these user forums at Cable Labs. They'd have them once a quarter, and we had some internal development going on. So now, yes, we're putting out systems now with great margin, because we went from having all this old refurbished equipment that would often break, and it might have cost $150,000-$200,000 to find all this equipment, and going to PXI, and I could sell systems for I think we're selling for $120,000 a test station and making great margins. Making almost no margin on the ones that were using all the old refurbished equipment. So it was actually able to fund, that was the internal generation of, once you get past a certain margin, and you're doing enough of them, it's like that's really helps the funding on other things going on. So we said, development into DOCSIS 1.0 and 1.1. So we already had, we had LabVIEW and test stand development going for, we had the whole DOCSIS standard because we're part of this user forum, all the NDAs and all that. So we're working on things, and then we knew at that point Agilent had a 2-bay test rack, and they're kind of like the ones that were, they weren't the standard yet, but you could see that was the direction it was going. And I remember having an event where Cable Labs had Dactron, Ericsson, and Agilent, all with their test systems.
And how many people were you at this point?
I think at this point we were now probably 15 to 20 people.
So this is a 20-person company going up against Agilent Keysight, originally HP, the clear dominant player in the RF space.
Yep.
Was that intimidating?
yeah, exactly. We're like, even at that point, it was over $1 billion company. Like, okay, we had a few $1 million in sales this year.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
And so
everybody loves a David and Goliath story.
Oh, yeah.
Let's get real.
Yeah,
I mean, that's really what it is.
I'm proud to say, that on the production test system displaced HP, and then when it came to the DOCSIS, displaced Agilent. And I remember, being there at that event, and also there was, starting to work on DOCSIS 2.0, and I remember the guy that's manning the Agilent test station, and he said, "Yeah, DOCSIS 2.0 will never fly. We're not proceeding on it." And
oh wow, so they made a real strategic blunder there.
They did. And at the same time, in my back pocket, I'm saying, you know what? Through all of this interaction and networking, I'm working with somebody that I did another production test system for their products. They went to a place called Terrion in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they were the ones that had the only DOCSIS 2.0 chip in the CMTS, and then the cable modem. So we already had an MOU, joint development system. We're working on newest NI stuff, all the newest interfaces, all the newest software, and essentially when DOCSIS 2.0 was released, we jointly announced that we have they have the products and we have the test system. So it was it was pretty amazing. And we took the system out to Cable Labs, and the CTO, he was kind of on loan from Comcast. He listened to the presentation. He says, "You guys go out in the hallway." 5 minutes later, he comes out. He goes, "Okay, I talked to my people." He goes, "The system you're demoing here right now, you're not leaving until it's in our lab, and we want to buy 4 more."
Wow, that's an awesome story. I love that story. That's fantastic. So you had a real champion in Comcast. That was kind of your really. I mean, I guess RS was your first big win, but Comcast was the one that really pushed you into product.
There's a bit of a bit of kind of like shake up at Cable Labs back in the 2000 to 2001 timeframe, where they brought in some people from industry because it probably wasn't being managed as well as it should, and so they brought in some heavy hitters. One being the CTO from Comcast, and he ran Cable Labs for several years, and he was the one that just 2 years before is like I couldn't corner him at the trade shows, and now we had something that's like, okay, we have a DOCSIS, an actual honest to God DOCSIS 2.0 test system.
So you really won that, not based on the relationship with Comcast, but really just on product functionality.
Right. We're in all those user meetings. We're actually developing to that standard. And with the MOU, it kind of gave us a chance. We didn't make any money on that first project with Terrion, but it wasn't about making the money. It was saying, you know what, this company is going to have, with us working together, they are going to have the first DOCSIS 2.0 head end and CPE product. We're going to have the test system that tests that, and you differentiate yourself.
So do you think the story would have turned out differently if Keysight said, "Yeah, we're all in on DOCSIS 2"?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think it comes down to what we talked about earlier, being the agile, smaller company. Mm-hmm. We were able to crank out, I'm not trivializing it, but with probably 5 to 7 people working on DOCSIS 2.0, we were able to get the bulk of things done in 6 months. It would have taken them years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like,
and we think of that as a strategic error potentially, but as a missed opportunity. But there's also the other side of that. It's quite possible that they looked at it from a strategy perspective, and they said, okay, we're not going to be able to tackle this in the time frame that the market needs it. Somebody's going to go eat our lunch before we can even make it. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so does it even make sense to invest all of this money? Yeah. Now, it might very well have been a strategic error. Yeah. They might have missed something very, very big because Lord knows they have the resources. But with those resources comes an abundance of slow.
Yeah,
and they might not have been able to tackle it.
If I put my business hat on, I'd say they probably did the right thing, because based on their structure, even at that time, it would have taken teams of people, you add up everything. If you start doing the projected P&L on that, you're like, wow, we're going to spend 5 times more than we're going to get out of this over the next 3, 4, 5 years. It just wasn't, probably a business decision they could justify.
Yeah.
Whereas
It's
we look at it
interesting.
and say, you know what, if we can sell a DOCSIS 2.0 test system for $400,000 and we make, 60, 70% margin on it, we're going to do it.
Yeah, that's a lot of money for a 15
Yeah.
person business.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And
Especially
it highlights the glaring difference between the small, medium enterprise and the large enterprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're coming at life and their business from very, very, very different perspectives and a very, very, very different set of constraints.
Right.
And sometimes we forget because we look through business and life through our own lens that the view is very different from the other side.
Right.
Yeah. So at what point did you say, no more consulting? We're not doing that anymore.
What,
Did that ever
what-
happen?
Say
No more
what?
consulting. No more consulting.
Yeah, that actually, we had probably out of, I'd say maybe in the 2000 to 2001 timeframe, kind of think where before things started, the bottom started falling out of the tech industry. We said, look, we're making so much more, margin on standardizing on, and we actually had some of our own PXI products we designed,
Okay.
they weren't something you'd go, people were going to order dozens of them or anything like that, but they definitely were, when we did that, it was in support of our systems. But anyways, it just became more of a, I hate to say a drag, but you start looking at the finances of it. It's like, I've got one person that's a very talented engineer that's working on a project that's making, decent hourly consulting rate, but I sure need them on, like what they could actually provide, for this new area with DOCSIS 1.0 and 2.0, maybe some of the products we're working on. It was kind of night and day.
So the opportunity cost of having talent that was on a lower margin
Right.
project was what really drove you to say no more of that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'd say after about pretty much after 2001, we probably didn't do. I think we might have done one. Probably got convinced to do one, kind of time and materials type project, and said, yeah, shouldn't have done that. Just not that we lost money. It's just because, but there's always that. Was it scoped out right? Should the company be paying for that? Should we be paying for that? And it just, at the end of the day, it wasn't what we could be making, profit wise, and just probably the excitement. I think some of the people that were working on those were like, I'd rather be working on the cool thing that's going to generate all the excitement, and we're out at trade shows on, and
Well, the cool thing's what gets all the glory in stories and histories, right? What were these great achievements that I had and these great things that I adopted? It's the thing that happens in the background that nobody knows about all the things that we in the entrepreneurial journey quietly close or end.
right.
Right? It's what is the great thing that I did? Well, honestly, some of the greatest successes are when we said, okay, let's focus.
Stop. Yeah.
Let's focus on the things that make the most sense for us where we are today.
Yeah.
And
It might
let's
seem
just-
trivial. I mean, like the simple question that Sean asked, but that was a tough decision for me.
It's a very
Yeah.
tough decision. Well, the thing about hourly rates, right, or hourly consulting is it's so safe. You show up, you do the work, you get paid. It's like having a job,
Right.
And when you go to products, there is no guarantee that anybody's going to buy that thing ever again. Now, obviously, you had momentum, so I imagine momentum made your decision easier. But
Right. If the product side was just growing at a smaller pace, but it was growing so fast, like it literally was, hair on fire sometimes. Like, oh my gosh, we have to be ready for this event. We have to have this.
Yeah, right.
This ready. We have to hire more people. And managing that was not trivial. And it was so much disparity. And probably if things were a little bit different, I might have said, you know what, we might still have a team of 4 or 5 people that's going to work on these type of cool time materials projects that are might be more geographic based, because it's not that there was financially it still made sense. I think we were charging more per hour at that point, and by and large you're going to get paid for most of your time, so it wasn't a bad financial thing. It's just the opportunity cost of saying I don't even have time to sit down and figure out who we're going to hire.
Yeah.
So
and you're still bootstrapped at this point, right? Because you didn't go out and get funding to hire employees or anything like
no,
that.
we never brought in external funding.
Yeah, that's awesome, amazing.
Well, and bootstrapping has become in vogue in 2025.
Yeah, you didn't even use the word bootstrapping back then. I think you just called it building a business.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the way it was. And then the bright shiny lights of VCs. Oh God, remember that?
Yeah.
The bright shiny VC light at the beginning of the 21st century. And now PE and all these different things. But there's a lot of evangelism on what is now popularly known as bootstrapping right now, right today, and that sometimes the benefits definitely do not outweigh the costs in taking that fast money, if you will.
Yep.
So, but I think what's interesting now, just jumping ahead a little bit because I know your story, when you ultimately had to position yourself for an exit, and it wasn't to PE in those days, it was to a related company, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine if you were still doing consulting, that may have been a net negative when you went to sell the company, right?
I don't know if I would say a net negative, but it wouldn't have been as compelling of a story.
For
Right.
sure.
You know, and so, you know, I'd say we had some dark times between 2001 and 2005. There was, you know, we went so far in the hole. I, you know, personally had went, you know, significantly in debt to try to, you know, keep 4 or 5 people there. And, you know, we were at the point where I think for 2 years up until maybe mid 2003 that probably every payroll I was like, you know, am I going to get paid from this customer?
Yeah.
You know, giving them a 2% discount for net 10 versus net 30, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, trying to manage that was incredibly stressful. Got through it. We finally back in the black in 2005. So it took a few years, but you know, by doing that, we had stuff that you know people needed, and you know, I'd say that in 2006, you know, I said, okay, you know, my goal is to sell the company in 3 years, and it was 3 years and 3 months, and you know, there's a whole different phase at that point of saying, okay, well, you know, and you know, the good and bad. I mean, it's like you know, part of it is, but you're going to have to do things that you know, I don't want to call it window dressing, you know, but it's, you know, I've got to hire a VP of sales. I've got to hire a VP of marketing. I've got to have you know, chief engineer.
Yeah.
If
People need titles, right?
people are trying to, you know, look at, if they really, you know, look at
Still
it and say,
trying to
well, it's
figure
just
mine
Bob.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
that's not, you know,
Yeah.
devaluing what I brought to it, but
Yeah.
that's
Everybody in the company is a VP, right?
yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so, no, one of the things, you know, I should mention along there, that same CTO at Comcast, because we, you know, made their operation so much more efficient. In 2006, he came to me and said, hey, Bob, I think you might want to know that because one of the key suppliers of an RF protocol analyzer, they're based right there. They were based right there in Columbia, Maryland. He said their British parent company is wanting to divest of their, you know, they had bought this company like 5 years before, and he said you may want to start, you know, because at this point there was 6 or 7 people left of the company. It had already started, and you know, so I started talking with the person that was the boots on the ground, managing the operation in Colombia, and we ended up acquiring that company for like $250,000 in cash in late 2006, and
Wow.
that was the DOCSIS RF protocol analyzer that you know Averna to this day is still making. I think I figured out they've probably made you know $60 million on that
Wow.
on that particular product alone.
So that 250K acquisition really allowed you to really control the whole test stack for the whole market.
Yeah, essentially with that test rack, we'd got to the point where with NIPXI, a lot of our own boards and all that, there was no Tektronix, there was no Keysight, or at that point it was Agilent. There's nothing, you know. I think we even had you know some replacement for smart bits, you know, you know for all the packet type stuff. The one thing we didn't have was the RF protocol analyzer, and if that entity would have said, you know, the British company is like, yeah, we're done. That's little. They were at the point where like we're just going to close the door and throw the stuff in the trash. You know,
Yeah.
the
right.
5 or 6 people remaining go home. And if that would have happened, you know, and that's why I think why the CTO at Comcast said, hey, you know, this isn't good. We use these in our lab. You know, we use these in the test systems that test, you know, the full. You know, that's the only way to tell whether if the head end sends something and it's not processed correctly or vice versa. You know, you might be able to use it for other nefarious purposes too. But you know,
You know what I love about this though, Bob, is it's so perfect with what we were talking about earlier. A small business saved, right? Comcast, when the large business said, "Oh, this little protocol thing is we don't care about that. We need to get rid of that," right? And so the real risk to Comcast was not the small business. You saved him. It was the giant corporation that said, "This is peanuts. We can't be bothered." And that's you know, I see that in our business too. I tell customers, "Hey, look, man, you know, in our business, like this is it. We are totally all in on this thing. It's not peanuts to us." That's
yeah,
I love that story.
bigger company wouldn't even have touched it. You know, and for us, you know, the 250K investment, and I knew by you know kicking the tires and you know going up there looking at inventory, looking at people, was like, these are the people that are going to stay. Gonna have to give them a pretty decent salary to keep going on the DOCSIS 2.0 protocol analyzer. But with the inventory they already had with 1.0 and 1.1 products, I'm like, this would be a no-brainer. We made a return on investment in 2 months.
That's fantastic.
That's
So the inventory really made it work. So you know, I've been in that kind of situation where I've looked at businesses too, and you go in there, there's no inventory, and you see 5 employees, and you're like, so this is an immediate liability because as soon as I buy this company, I have to make payroll in 2 weeks, and there's no order backlog.
Right.
So,
and by inventory.
and by inventory, right?
And by inventory.
So it's interesting, you know, inventory is, oh God, I think small businesses have such a complicated relationship with inventory, but in this case, inventory is what allowed that business to continue, which is
if there would have been no inventory, even as a small business, it just would have made financial sense. And I knew, you know, like adding up, you know, some pretty high end, you know, senior FPGA design engineer salaries.
Yeah.
You know, and I knew, you know, because we had access to, you know, we were talking with the same customers, and we knew, hey, there's already, you know, there's 6, you know, sales right here, within like it will close within the first month,
Yeah,
and,
that order backlog or that sales pipeline is and inventory. That's what you need to make something like that.
that's part of the due diligence. Had to go in and really start understanding where, let's look at your pipeline and see where things are at, and is it real? Is it smoke and mirrors, and that they said, okay, you know what, and because it was the same industry, I knew, okay, Motorola is going to buy 3 of these,
and you were probably the only person in the United States that was actually qualified to value that company, to value the sales pipeline and the inventory. There was probably nobody else in the country that could do it except for you.
Yep.
Yeah.
All I know is I can hear misguided CFOs all across the country shuddering at this entire conversation about that value of the inventory.
Yes, no doubt, for sure.
But, all right. Well, I'll tell you what. Frankly, I found this to be super incredible. What I want to take this somewhere just a little left field.
Yeah.
You piqued my interest. What about the brew pub?
Yes.
Oh my God! Like that. I mean, what was this your baby? Was this you started brewing beer? Did you invest with someone? What is this side business that you had?
This was a crazy story. I'd been brewing since actually when I worked at Medtronic. A friend that I went to Iowa State with, we both worked there. Said, hey, let's try this new thing called homebrewing. First batch not so good, but it took maybe like 3 or 4 batches. And back then, craft beer wasn't what it was today. And it's like, we can make better beer than we can buy in the store. And so I did that, for, like I said, between 93 and 2010, when this all started to happen, and won homebrewing awards, been to all the homebrewing conferences, and, the kind of that fortuitous thing of like, selling the company and having, time and money on the not so distant horizon. Said, okay, let's do this. And I kicked the tires. Essentially the broker gave me the keys, and I spent 9 months going through that property with contractors, architects, plans, business case, best to worst case, and ended up, and lots of neighborhood, because it was not able to happen in our neighborhood. Had to work with people to get the zoning done, and neighborhood approvals and all that. So lots of stuff behind the scenes, and it was a little bit of a leap of faith. I think it was an educated leap of faith. I didn't think that it was going to. It actually ended up being, like, let's say after the first 6 months, it ended up being more successful than I thought it would be. And a lot of that was just being out there. I had probably at that point been to 1,000 different breweries and brew pubs and know what works, and kind of applying a little bit of the engineering mindset. I know if I look at these 80 traditional styles of beer, probably if a table walks in, they can probably break them down into 8 different ones: malty or hoppy or light or sour or whatever, And so we said, we're going to have something that anybody that wants beer, and then actually we did cocktails and wines and all that, some award-winning type stuff on that side, but said we're gonna have something for everybody when they come in here. And then the food was all paired to go with the different types of libations, and all from Georgia, local farms as much as possible. And so it was just this really cool story of did all the due diligence, and gonna make this work. My goal was to be top 5 U.S. brew pub in the first, I think it was 5 years. I think I was saying we hit that at 3 years.
That's incredible.
3 years in. Cool. If you look at Beer Advocate, Rate Beer, Untapped, if you kind of add up and average all the scores on those, and I was doing that every year, and we were right there at number 5 after 3 years.
Well, at 10:30 Eastern, I assure you this is tea. But you've got me feeling like I really want a nice malty beer here at this hour of the morning. But I think what I'm hearing is something very, very similar in when you started this business to when you started Dactron. Mm-hmm. You got in early. Your brain was looking forward. Right. Your brain wasn't, well, I've got these skills. I guess I might as well get in business. What the hell? Right. It was, I'm looking forward. I see something. Oh, and I happen to have these skills. And it's about doing something different and doing something forward looking. And, I think by the time you get out into the world where they start writing a plethora of articles and they say, is it too late to get into the brew pub business in 2025? No, it's not too late. By the time you see a whole bunch of those on, insert whatever your industry is, it's probably too late.
Yeah.
Right. You're not being forward looking. You're like, oh, I have this idea in hindsight. And everybody else is doing great. I guess I will too. Yeah, and I think that's a great strategy note for us to really consider.
Yeah, and you have to keep in mind that the 2010 to 2015 timeframe roughly was just the golden age for craft beer. Not that it's not exciting anymore, but now and I'm big into data, obviously, so the Brewers Association, that kind of oversees all the U.S. breweries, brew pubs. They have a chief economist, PhD, and he slices and dices the data every year, and you can see the trends that based on compared now to, like, say 2014. Where craft beer was, like, in the golden age. Now people they're still drinking the same amount, but they're drinking a different mix. And he's got it diced down into here's under 30, here's 30 to 45, here's and so whether it be, cocktails or spirits or beer or, seltzers, there's so many things in it that, you have to be on top of that. And that's where, if I was going to start one today, it would be a whole different mix. It wouldn't be, 100% beer focused. There'd be some different things in there too.
Canned cocktails. Who knew?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Hey,
exactly.
the canned old fashions that they used to give on Delta, those are pretty good.
There you go. There you go. Now, if only we could make them smoked.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, I would like to thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any last words, any last advice? If you could just pick one thing just to tell people they might be struggling, they might be considering starting their own business, or they might be looking in a later stage of their business where they want to sell it or something to that effect, or whatever their exit plan is. What thoughts do you have for folks?
Yeah, I'd say, if you've got a business, you can obviously tell through listen to this that, I'm big on due diligence, sometimes maybe to a fault, I want to make sure, you can't always be guaranteed that a move you're going to make, whether it's something simple within your company or even as significant as selling, is going to be the right decision. But, if you come through and you say, I did my due diligence, I did as best I can, and, maybe out of maybe you won't try 10 times, but out of 10 times, maybe, you'll be successful on 7 of those. And, there's a couple things I did along the way. It's like, well, you know what? We did the best we could. That was a development idea, a product idea that just, it's not going to do what we thought it did. And understanding, when to be able to say, all right, we have to cut ties with that, and that kind of maybe sounds unemotional, but, because, hey, this is, my product, my babies, or my people, sometimes you have to make some tough decisions, and don't run it based on just emotion. Hey, this, I've got to see this product through this, like at the end of the day, you look at it from a business perspective. Is it going to make sense to keep doing it? So, I'd say as far as, if your goal is to sell your business, surround yourself with good people, make sure that you've got the right team. Don't be afraid to make changes to get that right team. And, it's a delicate balance. If you go out there and say, hey, exaggerating, I put my business for sale on Facebook Marketplace, you're probably not gonna be happy with the results, but that's where networking and just, the way it happened for me was just some very casual conversations, almost like, is he kind of going the direction I think he's going? And he's probably saying the same thing about me, and it took, probably a year and a half of just kind of seeing each other at events and talking about that stuff. And the timing, ended up being just right for both of us. So, and I had a 3-year window. That's when I said, I'd like to sell my company in 3 years, and so during that time, I'm starting to, instead of, attending the technical sessions at a conference, I'm actually, hey, I might want to talk to this guy, this girl, it's like, there's different goals. So just don't be afraid,
Yeah.
You're not always gonna make the right decision, but if you can go through the processes I've talked about with these different things this last hour and a half, then at least you say, I gave it my best shot.
Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, for my amazing RF Frontiers team, your takeaways? What have you got for me?
Well, I think Bob is very product focused, right? So he did it with Dactron, and then he did it again with the Brew Club. Very focused on delivering exactly the right product features for a very specific set of customers, right? That was my takeaway. And also, I think the big takeaway is that it is possible for a 15, 20 person company to beat Keysight, $1 billion or $2 billion company or whatever they are. Right?
Absolutely.
That's a real inspirational story. And then when you couple that with Bob's comment earlier about spending $25 million or supporting families through $25 million of payroll, this is an all-American success story. It's fantastic. So,
Amen. Amen. Ariel, you got any takeaways?
Yeah. Well, I love the emotional, relational aspect of everything. So even just what you just said, Bob, about, if you're making a choice that's difficult, being able to just look back and say, okay, well, I did this and it didn't work, but that's okay, moving forward, versus just focusing on the negative of how it didn't work out. I think that happens a lot, and things get overanalyzed, and being able to just give the facts of what you did, making sure you did it to your best, but then being able to move forward and go to the next step. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people lack that ability, and then they spend a lot of time dwelling on and analyzing things that don't need to be. I think that's something that I know myself I do all the time. So being able to
Amen,
move forward
sister.
is good.
Well, I'd like to offer something deep and wonderful like my co-hosts here, but mine's very shallow, frankly. I've been able to do some great things in my career. I've been able to rub elbows with some people who are truly the greats, names that folks will never know. I never in a million years dreamed that I would be meeting one of the guys who was partially responsible on the team for putting an end to that god-awful dial-up modem sound that we all have ringing in our ears if we're old enough and have enough, well, have enough missing hair.
Yes.
So thank you for putting an end to that, Bob.
Yes.
I appreciate your contribution.
Remember dial-up, okay?
There you go.
Oh, stop.
There you
Oh,
go.
yeah.
I feel like I wish I had the sound effect loaded into my soundboard here. So with that said, folks, thank you so much for joining us. Bob, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I know I speak on behalf of my co-hosts here. Thank you so much for joining us. You've got a great story, or stories, as it were. It's been an absolute pleasure. Until the next time on RF Frontiers, folks, dream big.